Good morning, everybody. We'll be starting shortly. Seamus, why don't you start off with our welcome?
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris. Welcome, everyone, to our Canadian International Council. And we are happy to have you here today for this Foreign Policy by Canadians event. My name is Seamus Lim-Healy, and I'm a member of the Executive Committee of the Canadian International Council, Victoria branch, here on Vancouver Island. Before we do get underway, it's important to recognize that CIC Victoria members live, work, and learn on the traditional territories of the Algonquin-speaking peoples, the Songhees and the Esquimalt nations, and gratefully acknowledge the Coast Salish nations on whose traditional territories we meet together. For those not familiar with the Canadian International Council, we are an independent, nonpartisan, membership-driven think tank with the express mandate to engage Canadians on international affairs and promote a deeper understanding of Canada's role in a changing international landscape. What makes us different from many think tanks is that we have branches in 17 Canadian cities with some 1,400 members who are deeply involved with and interested in Canada's role in the world. You can find out more about us by Googling the Canadian International Council, where you will also find our CIC Victoria webpage. Today, our moderator is the Honourable Mary Collins, and I will introduce her shortly, and then Mary will take over and introduce our speaker and discussant. After the talk today, we will have an audience Q&A portion, and for this, please use the Q&A area. We will do our best to get to all of them. We will also be recording this event. As mentioned, our moderator today is the Honourable Mary Collins, and Mary has worked in the public, private, and not-for-profit sectors. She was the Member of Parliament for Capilano Howe Sound from 1984 to 1993, and served as Associate Minister of National Defence, Minister responsible for the status of women, and Minister of Health. She has been involved in projects to support women in political life in Vietnam, Ukraine, and Mongolia, and spent 5 years living in Russia, working on health policy. Mary, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Seamus. And I would like to add my welcome to all those who joined us today from near and far. I think we have a very exciting program. We'd just like to say this is the last of our CIC Victoria events for the year, and it's been a very exciting year, and particularly these last sessions about Canada's relationships in the Asia Pacific. Today, the focus is on Canada and India. And of course, we know that Canada's had a very long relationship with India and a very, very positive one in so many different ways. And we have a huge number of course, Canadians of Indian heritage living in Canada, over 5% of our population, and many students from India who have flocked to our universities, colleges, and schools. So today we're going to talk about the trade relationships, the foreign relationships, and the personal relationships between Canada and India. And as Seamus has mentioned, we welcome your questions. Please use the question box to put them forward, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. We're going to start off with our speaker, Brian Parrott, who will give a presentation and then be followed by our discussant, Stuart Beck. And what's interesting is that these two gentlemen are long-term associates and friends. In fact, they both worked in the Department of Global Affairs or Foreign Affairs, whatever it was called in those days. And I think Stuart takes credit for bringing Brian into the department. And a little bit about Brian, of course, he's a Vancouver Islander, third generation, living in Victoria and Saanich. He began his career with the BC government as Assistant Deputy Minister of Energy and Mines, and then went on to Global Affairs, where he served in many different roles, and retired in 2018 after serving as Minister Commercial at the High Commission of Canada to India in New Delhi. So an expert in this area, and I think without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Brian.
Well, thank you, Mary. I'm just going to load up my presentation here and begin. Except I just have to make this a little bit smaller. Here we are. Whoops. So India, the Indo-Pacific, and Canada. What next for Canada-India foreign and trade relations? Today, we're going to put India a little bit under the microscope, as the CIC program has asked to do. And we're going to see how, and indeed, if Canada can play a bigger role in this region, and more particularly with India. To examine this question, we first have to look at India from its own perspective, I think. And I think that's really an important point, that it is we need to understand India from how they see themselves, and then look at Canada and what Canada has to offer in 4 key areas of interest to India, namely national security, the politics, socio-economic dimension of India, sort of the massive urbanization, the growing middle class, the young population, and finally, we'll look at trade and investment, and then see what kind of a role Canada can play in that context. I have to start telling the story a little bit with maps, because it helps to sort of position India and understand some of its challenges and opportunities. So this is India, half a world away from us here on the West Coast, 13 and a half hours ahead of us time-wise, and it's a 14-hour flight from Delhi to Vancouver. The population of India now is 1.38 billion people in 28 states and 8 union territories. There's 22 what they call scheduled languages, or officially or sort of legally recognized languages in the country. There's over 1 billion Hindus, 185 million Muslims, 32 million Christians, 26 million Sikhs, and a further 26 million other people. And amazingly, it's the world's largest democracy, something that every Indian takes extremely seriously and is very proud of. But to try and understand India, we have to understand how it's situated in the neighborhood in which it's in. So you can see it's situated between Pakistan and Bangladesh, Nepal and Bhutan, Afghanistan's not far away, China on its northern border, and of course, the ASEAN countries. This map doesn't show it, but it's not very far away from the African East Coast and of course, the Middle East. So this brings us to the issue of national security. And I'll start in the north, which has been in the news a little bit lately. This is India's northern frontier with China and Pakistan. It's one of the world's current geopolitical hotspots, I would argue. The increased presence of China on this border, or the line of control as it's called, is significant. And the it's created an existential challenge for India, with the line of control between China has never been as sort of prominent as it has more recently. The region, of course, is home to the Himalayas, exceptionally rugged territory, prone to earthquakes, but it also has an enormous amount of water, and water as a resource to sustain the populations in this region, and moreover, to generate the power that's needed for a growing industrial base in India and China, indeed, cause this significant friction. The rivers that flow south from the Himalayas may flow through Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, or Pakistan. And it's a bit of a complicated mess trying to figure out how to manage these water resources with so many competing interests in this region. Added to the tension over water and ethnicity is the seemingly unrelenting tension on the border with Pakistan, India's nuclear neighbor and apparent safe haven for terrorists, according to the US State Department report released in June of this year. Here, the issue is driven by religion, and the British division of the Punjab and Kashmir at the time of independence, or just before independence, and constant skirmishes have followed 3 wars over Kashmir. And although Modi had tried, when he first was elected as prime minister, to warm relations, this has not worked out. It's kind of failed, and these border skirmishes have continued with loss of life. India, of course, keeps a keen eye on the two mice between these elephants, Nepal and Bhutan, and has been spending enormously in the northeast part of India and the North State. I wonder if I have in this area here, I hope you can see that. And here I've just lost track here. Lots of expenditures in this part. China actually claims that this northern part of Arunachal Pradesh is claimed by China because it sees it's part of South Tibet and therefore theirs. Water issues predominate here. China is talking about building a dam on one of the rivers in China that flows south through this region and down into Bangladesh and out into the Indian Ocean. So India has countered by saying, well, they'll build dams downstream, and this causes a great deal of tension, as one can imagine. The line of control between India, Pakistan, and China will continue to be a national security issue, and Kashmir is a simmering pot of discontent, and Modi's Hindu-centric BJP party has stirred that pot recently by removing Kashmir and Jammu, this area, autonomous status. In addition to its northern frontier, the Indian Ocean is faced with what is now called China's string of pearls. These sort of red dots are noted as the string of pearls, right in, of course, in India's maritime backyard. These trade routes, largely focused on oil from Africa and the Middle East, result in 80% of China's oil going through the Malacca Straits. And of course, India is also competing for this oil and vying for this oil from the Middle East and Africa to feed its massive refinery industry domestic industry in India. In addition to this, India has, it's not shown on this map, but India has invested in a port here in southern Iran and have developed access into Pakistan, which will allow them to deliver, access into Afghanistan, which will allow them to deliver aid without having to traverse Pakistan. India has generally close relations with Afghanistan, and this is a geopolitical move so that they can support Afghanistan and try and move them away from the terrorist-prone Pakistan. We have to also look at the internal security issues that are also significant in India. Terrorism in India continues to be a challenge. Maoists have undertaken 2 attacks in Chhattisgarh, which is a state over on this side of India, and Maharashtra on the west coast. In 2019, terrorist attacks in Kashmir continue, and a reunited but separate Sikh-dominated Punjab state, Khalistan, remains of concern in Delhi. Meanwhile, the world's commercial center of gravity is, according to many, shifting away from the so-called Pacific Rim to the Indian Ocean Rim. This extends from the western side of Australia up along the Indonesian coast, around India and the Gulf states, and then along the African east coast. So with all these geopolitical forces, the concept of a renewed focus on the Indonesian Pacific has arisen. Which brings us to the Indo-Pacific region, an interesting concept in that, in fact, one of the first uses of the term that I've found was by oceanographers looking at the biosphere in this part of the globe, and which is basically this sort of darker blue color on this map. But more recently, the term has been resurrected in the security context. Quadrilateral discussions between the US, Australia, Japan, and India began again in 2017, and the talks there have been largely focused around in the context of a free and open Indo-Pacific. So in the security context, it's not really a geographic term, but more of a security term. While the Quad has some sense of a formal organization, other countries are also beginning to look at the Indo-Pacific as a region of great trading importance. France's Macron has spoken of the need for increased attention in this region, as has Germany and much of the EU indeed. And again, a lot of this is in reaction to China's Belt and Road Initiative and its aggressive approach to land corridors in Pakistan, which will link China directly to the Indian Ocean. However, there's a genuine economic merit in these and other European countries focusing more attention on this region. Of course, it also includes the ASEAN countries, which are in the 21st century talked about as being the powerhouses of the economic world. And so it's a very important economic region. It's a very sensitive security region, and the two are closely intertwined. So turning to the politics, the political landscape is very much dominated by Prime Minister Modi. Modi broke the grip of the Nehru-Gandhi Congress Party in 2014 and came to power with a vision of turning India into a global powerhouse. He solidified his power again in the 2019 election with the BJP, alone getting a majority of seats in the Lok Sabha, or the lower house. The former chief minister of Gujarat, who created the concept of the Gujarati model, which is to say, we'll develop industry, and as a result of that industrial development, we can pull everybody up by their bootstraps. Modi, unlike the Nehru prime minister and that the Congress party, basically has the outlook that sort of the Horatio outlook, Horatio Alger outlook. That is to say, everybody should become richer than their father, and with people doing what they can do to achieve their own potential, the state can be less involved in their lives. Whereas the previous regime was much more, it's okay to be poor, the state will look after you. At least this was in the early days of the new country. He's reformed a significant amount of, or brought in a significant amount of reforms in India, from Make in India, which is a strong push to have investment flow into India to revitalize its manufacturing sector. He started something called the Swachh Bharat, which is to clean India. He brought in a harmonized GST-style tax, which largely modeled after the Canadian, which has done a tremendous amount of good to ease transportation and movement of goods within India. He's reformed bankruptcy and insolvency laws, which were a significant barrier to growth in India. And he's also pushing huge investments in India's infrastructure, but there's still a long way to go with roads, with ports, with airports. One thing about India that you have to understand is the size of the population and the size of the country make it a really challenging country in which to work. Of course, it's also a country of extremes, with extreme poverty and extreme wealth. There's extremes between religion and all kinds of issues boil up as a result of that. They've put a huge push on smart cities and trying to develop cities, and I'll get into this in a little bit more a little later. And then, of course, lots of reforms coming in the agriculture sector, which brings us to a very topical issue right now. And I just wanted to mention a few words on farming and the raw politics of it, as I see them. Stuart may be able to add more to this, but 47% or 47% or 647 million people accrue their income from farming. At least that's my estimate. The government doesn't actually know how many people are farmers or are reliant on farming, but some reports have it as high as 57%, but I think it's closer to this 47%, as I've said. And obviously, to win the Lok Sabha, you have to have an enormous proportion of the farm vote, if you will. And what's happened lately is the reforming in the agricultural sector has taken place because it's a mess of what are called minimum support prices. There are huge subsidies in the agriculture sector for inputs. For example, for some of our fertilizer that comes to India from Canada, potash, all of that potash is the transportation of it to get from port to the farm is subsidized. And it's a huge legacy. And Modi, in his fashion of trying to reform some of these real challenging issues, has taken on this issue of the state buying all the products with minimum support prices, and is trying to open it up to the private sector. And the farmers, as you've seen in the news and in the papers, are very concerned about this because they figure that this will put downward pressure on the minimum support price and will therefore erode their profitability. So just moving on, in terms of India's foreign outlook, Modi has been much more externally focused than previous governments. He's recognized the strength of the Indian diaspora around the world, and he has reached out to ASEAN countries and his neighbors, but maintains a wary eye on Pakistan, despite his early overtures to that country. And despite India's independent stance, Modi has continued to shore up relations with the US through a variety of economic and security fora. He has maintained positive inclination to Canada since his election, as our former High Commissioner, Mr. Beck, had the foresight to be an early supporter of his initiatives in Gujarat. But he also recognized the importance of the diaspora in Canada because with 1 million people, the Indians actually say 1.2 million people of Indian descent are Canadian citizens. And so he recognizes that has the opportunity to bring us together. And on his visit in April of 2015, he was very, very keen to say that Canada and India had strong relations, and going forward, we'd be in good shape. Perhaps ironically, though, this is also the source of the grief for Indian-Canada relations. The Indian government feels there remains support for Khalistan in the Sikh community in Canada, and many issues flow from this, among them the nitty-gritty of information transfer on Canadian citizens of Indian descent, but they're Canadian citizens, and Canada is wary of passing on all kinds of information that the Indians would like about Canadian citizens. And these issues continue to be a thorn in the side of our relations, and this has caused a number of sores to develop from time to time. During Prime Minister Trudeau's visit to India in 2018, the whole issue came up again and was a significant embarrassment to both Canada and India. And then now on the farmers issue, where the Prime Minister made some remarks that caused the Indians to be concerned about him meddling in their internal affairs. But otherwise, Modi sees our size, our resources, and our agricultural capabilities as a potential benefit to India. He also continues to covet our pension funds as growing investors in India. A little bit on the socioeconomic dimensions. India is forecast to be the most populous country by 2027, according to the UN, surpassing China. This brings a constant set of challenges for the country. Housing, the education system, cities are all under massive pressure accompanying a surging population. And under Modi, it's the cities that are having to clean up under the Swachh Bharat program. Additionally, the government is investing in smart city technologies and has, they claim, changed the world market for LED lighting based on the volumes demanded. Again, with India, it's the size of the country, the size of the population that creates so many economic opportunities. The Indian population, the Indian urban population is growing. So there's a massive shift to cities. And these cities are enormous. The three largest cities in India India, in India, Mumbai, Delhi, and now Bangalore have a combined population of some 11 million more than all of Canada. The remaining 7 cities, in the top 10, have populations. None of those cities have populations less than 2.8 million people. So we have this massive urbanization going on, yet at the same time, we have 67% of the people still living in rural India. So as I say, it's this country of extremes where we have, in these rural areas, we have some extreme poverty. 50 million people are believed to be below the poverty line in India, whereas we have this massive urban population, massive because 1.38 billion people, and you take 33% of that, that's a big number. And then, of course, in those cities, we're seeing much higher, well, there's extreme wealth in some of these cities, but there's also a growing middle class. So how do they cope with all of this? They have to undertake massive spending to improve their airports. The rail system needs massively to be upgraded. The British legacy of the rail system in India is fantastic, but the investment in it hasn't kept pace with the growth of the economy, so they need to continue to spend. It's a youthful population, and here in this smudgy green, I've noted the median age currently is 28.4 years old. That means half the population is older than that, and half the population is younger than that. So it's a very youthful population, which puts pressure on the job market. And just as a comparison, Canada's median age is 40.9 years. So it's a major push for training programs like Make in India. It also drives emigration, obviously the immigration to Canada. Despite this, unemployment rates pre-COVID were in the 5.5 range and had been falling. And this age profile drives the mobile telephone market. Nearly 80% of web interactions in India are done on a mobile phone. Turning quickly to trade and investment, as I've said, it's a huge market, but to penetrate that market, it has to be done, it seems to me, more on India's terms. The world continues to beat a path to India, so it's a very competitive place. The French, the Germans, the English, they're all there. Australia considers it its backdoor. So Canada's competing in a very competitive market. So from the Canadian perspective, India is Canada's 9th largest export market. Over the past 10 years, we've seen the average annual growth rate in our exports grow by 13%, but still that's only 1% of that we ship to the US. Our exports are traditional and resource-based, with 70% being our resources, and I mean by that coal, copper ore, iron ore, scrap metal, things like this. 10% are agriculture, and by that I largely mean pulses, and trade and investment agreements in the works for decades, but no results. From the Indian perspective, India needs inward investment and substantially more reforms to become self-reliant. On the trade side, its top 25 trading partners don't include Canada. The top 25 exporters to India account for 82% of its imports, but Canada's not in that number. India's top 25 export markets, on the other hand, account for 62% of its exports, but again, do not include Canada. When I was there, we had a very long conversation with the Indian government on their trade exports, because a lot of the stuff that comes to Canada from India goes through the United States. And for some reason on the Indian export numbers, they count that as going to the US, which actually adds to their trade deficit with the US. And we tried to convince them they should look more deeply at that. So in short, we see India as being more important than India perceives Canada, except for inward investment. This is largely led by Canada's pension funds, and Brookfield will count for at least $63 billion by our estimates, but perhaps more. India is a tough and challenging market. The photos here are some that I took when the Saskatchewan minister was visiting. These guys, this is in Mumbai. These guys are shoveling yellow peas into bags for movement. The reason this is happening and the reason this is interesting is because the ship comes over from Canada. It then has to, and because of the limited port capacity, then it has to unload onto a barge. The barge gets pulled up to the wharf and then it's hand unloaded into the warehouse. And then these guys hand unload and put into bags. There's huge logistical challenges. There's non-tariff barriers. Still a tremendous amount of thinking within the bureaucrats that tariffs are an important source of revenue. Trade and services via tourism and education can grow, and trade and investment, investment is important, as I've said already, but trade and investment agreements are not India's long suit. They've pulled out of RCEP. They're wary about the CPTPP. And as I've said, our trade agreements are going nowhere. So can these guys work it out? Well, perhaps, but in what areas? From a security perspective, it's my view that Canada has little to offer in terms of assets to be deployed or engaged in the Indo-Pacific. It's a long way from Esquimalt or Halifax. During my time in India, the defense attaché had a difficult task of engaging both sides, and we sell precious little defense equipment to India. The area that they're most interested in is Canada's knowledge of cold weather warfare. In terms of India's, and when Minister Sajjan visited, that was a bit of a help, but nothing really concrete came of that. In terms of India's socio-economic needs, Canada can and should play a continuing role through education services, both in and out of India, and we will continue to play an important role through immigration. Canada has smarts in the smart city arena, if you will, and we can continue to find goods and service export opportunities. But from a trade perspective, we will continue to sell what India needs. But again, as I've said before, it will be on their terms. And I don't see much likelihood, notwithstanding some of the interests of the business community, in a trade agreement. It's just not a priority for India. And some of the things that we need and see in our modern day trade agreements are just not on for India. And here I'm thinking of labor and environmental aspects of modern day trade agreements. India still is not there, and it's going to be a long time and a lot of work to get them there. I think metallurgical coal can grow. Our pulses will go up and down as the Indians become more self-sufficient. And there are methods by which we can moderate that trade. So what do I think? Personally, these are my personal views. We have to have a somewhat of a nuanced way forward. Canada has to recognize that India is on its way to becoming a major player in the world economy. And despite its security challenge, it's well situated. We must remain important to India to be noticed. India is very much, what can you do for me lately? Continued immigration and the export of our educational services and tourism will be very important in this regard. And in a post-COVID environment, there's no reason not to see continued education of Indians and the growth in that sector. And our resources will continue to be in demand. But competing on high-tech products, we have to be extremely price conscious. And this is not China or Japan. We have a lot to offer in terms of smart cities, as I said, but so does Europe and the competition. And particularly, we have to better understand the Indian diaspora in Canada and not let our relations be affected by the views of some of the diaspora in Canada and the politics around that, which unfortunately has gotten into the way of our relations, which were on a very high plateau from 2014 to 2016. Not to say that was when I was in India, but they've deteriorated since. And Mary, I think with that, I'll end it and allow Stuart a word in.
Great. Well, Thank you very much, Brian. That was a wonderful journey that you've taken us on through the challenges and the opportunities in the security world, the trade world, the political world, and the socio-economic dimensions of what's happening in India. A great journey. Thank you so much. And just before I turn to our discussant, just to remind everyone, if you've got questions, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll hopefully get to those fairly soon. So for our discussant, a colleague of Brian's, as I mentioned before, Stuart Beck, and Stuart had a 32-year career with global affairs, foreign affairs. It changed its name many times during the time you were there. And he had played many roles, both in Ottawa and internationally, serving in the United States, in Taiwan, People's Republic of China. And then his final posting, he served as Canada's High Commissioner to the Republic of India, with concurrent accreditation to the Kingdom of Bhutan and to Nepal. He retired from Foreign Affairs in 2014 and took on the role as President and Chief Executive Officer of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, based in Vancouver. It's one of the important think tanks in terms of our relationships in that whole region. So Stuart, we're delighted to have you with us, and please give us your comments.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Mary. It's been a real pleasure listening to Brian's overview. I think you've done a great job capturing a lot of the key elements, Brian. It's sometimes hard to follow something like that, but I can give you a few perspectives on what you were saying. But I also like to just maybe open up, and if Chris, if you can put up the slides, I just want to situate how Canadians think about India right now, because we've just completed our most recent national opinion poll. And I think there's some very interesting observations that we can take away. And I'll do this very quickly, just because time is of the essence, and I think we want to get to the questions. So if you can go to the next slide, Chris, that would be great. Thanks. So this just again very quickly on the foundation. We like to see ourselves as a catalyst for engagement with Asia, but also Asia's bridge to Canada. We really look at areas that we can work with the Asia Pacific and Asia region as a whole. And I'll talk a little bit about the concept of Indo-Pacific, because Brian brought it up, and I think he brought it up in a very important way. Next slide, please. So just to situate India relative to China and the United States by 2050. So India is going to become a very important economy for Canada. We can't ignore the fact that China is going to be the biggest economy in the world by 2050, but India is going to be the second largest and quite a bit bigger than the United States by 2050. So again, this is going to be hard for us to adjust to from a Canadian perspective, because the United States is such an important trading partner for us. But we need to understand and develop an awareness of where India is going to sit going forward, and why we have to build these relationships that Brian was talking about. Next slide, please. So we just, as I said, completed and made presentations 2 weeks ago on a national opinion poll. It's quite an opus, and there are lots of different questions. So I've just parsed out some things that would be of interest to this conversation. So next slide, please. So this is, I think, an important slide for 2 reasons. One, it shows that India is becoming more important, at least from a Canadian perspective. People understand that India is going to become more important, which I think is quite critical. And you can see the difference between 2014, or maybe I don't want to say I had any impact on this, but I started the foundation in 2014, and it's up to 72% now. But if you take a look at China, that's really quite concerning, and it's understandable why Canadians now see China more as a threat than an opportunity, and it's a big drop in from 2018 to 2020. The two Michaels, of course, will be part of that process. But the aggressiveness of China in the international marketplace, I think really, and what's been going on between China and the United States, has a big impact on that. Next slide, please. And again, this is where, on a scale of 1 to 10, the economic importance of these regions, and you can see that India has been increasing. The understanding that India is going to become more important has become part of this trend over the last few years. So again, this is something that's important. And what I think another takeaway is that people still understand that China is going to be will be economically important for Canada. So I think that's critical. Next slide, please. And just in terms of support for Canadian government to ratify an FTA, again, what's staggering on this slide is the drop in support for an FTA with China. But again, if you take a look at India, there's not a big difference between 66% support and 63% support, but it's still, again, part of that is this conversation. And this is at a time when I think, and I might disagree with Brian a little bit on this, but I think the opportunity is there for us to really think about and moving forward with the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. And it is a long and arduous slog. I mean, we've been going at the FIPA, gosh, since I started off as an ADM in 2006. We were talking about a FIPA with India, and it still hasn't got there. And we started negotiations for a Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement in 2010. And after I left in 2014, and we had already had 10 rounds. I don't know how many rounds there are now in the CEPA negotiation, but I honestly think that we can probably do something with India if we really put our minds to it and put our shoulder to the wheel. Anyway, next slide, please. And this is a survey that we just we did over the last 2 years, and we surveyed roughly 12,000 business leaders in Asia in 6 key countries: China, India, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and Singapore. And if you take a look at India, in the business community, there's huge support for an FTA. Okay, it's a problem when you get to the bureaucracy, but actually business sees the advantages of an FTA with Canada. And a lot of that's, I'm sure, driven by the technology companies that are in India. And then I think that that was the last slide, but is that the next one, our Asia Watch slide? So this is something, a little bit of a promo piece, but we produce what I would call a short and crisp analysis of what's going on in Asia. And I would encourage you, if you're interested in this, to subscribe. It's free, and you'll get it 3 times a week in a push basis in your inbox. And I think you'll find some interesting stuff. We just recently did a good piece, and I'm not going to go over it because I think Brian did an excellent job explaining the farmers' protest. But as an example, something like that, doing a bit more in-depth analysis on what's going on, and I think you might find it useful. So that's just my a quick scene setter. And I just to go back to some of the things that Brian was saying, and to make a few points. And I see my predecessor, Joseph Caron, is on as one of the participants, and I have to say, I felt somewhat badly because, in a way, because Joseph had to deal with a very difficult issue with India prior to his departure, and that had to do with refusing a visa for a security official, which unfortunately the reasons for that refusal got into the public, and because of that, India got very upset with us. That, along with the fact that, more in a diplomatic sense, we decided to link the signing of one agreement to the linking of another agreement, which the Indians got very upset with us over. And so when I arrived in India, I sat around for 4 months with nothing to do because nobody wanted to talk to me, and I couldn't present my credentials. So it allowed me some time to think about what was important. And where, was Canada important to India, quite frankly? And I came away after sitting around for 4 months and, talking to people. I could meet with business people, but I couldn't meet with government officials. And one of the things, I said, okay, where do we sit in terms of importance for India, Canada? And if the tier 1 countries of importance are the P5 and the countries that surround India, where do we sit in the second tier of importance to India? And I came to the realization very quickly that we were at the bottom of the second tier of importance. And at the top of the second tier was Australia, because they sold a lot of energy. Okay, they were doing $20 billion in coal alone in 2010 when I arrived. So Australia and the access that the Australian High Commissioner had was quite evident. The second country that was really up there was Israel. And I said to myself, well, why is Israel so important? So you'd go to events, you'd go to the national days and this, that, and the other. And, the prime minister would be there, the national security advisor, others. And they would all go and talk to the Israeli ambassador. And I, for the life of me, couldn't figure it out until I realized, and if you've been in Delhi, their embassy is right across the street from the residence. So I got to know the ambassador quite well. Canada has, as Brian said, one defense attaché in our High Commission. Israel had 35 defense attachés. So it'll just give you an indication of what's important to India. And so it was no wonder that the Israeli ambassador had the access that he had. So if you're going to change that, what was it? And Brian has brought out some of those issues. What will be important to India? What would make Canada, front and center in that issue, in their kind of foreign policy mindset? And we built a strategy around 4 areas, and those 4 areas was infrastructure, and it wasn't about building infrastructure because we had built a lot of infrastructure in India using aid money when CETA had a huge program to build dams in India, for those who remember. It was really about financing infrastructure. So building a strategy around bringing the pension funds into India as an example. The second area was energy. And energy is really a critical issue for India. We were trying to, they were then, and they still are, building huge amounts of, huge capacity and bringing LNG into the country. And because we have huge resources, and quite frankly, this is our problem, if we could get energy to either coast, how do we build that relationship with India? And there was a tremendous amount of interest of buying gas and oil from Canada. And we did a lot of work in that particular area. And in fact, we ended up with a back-to-back agreement with Indian Oil on taking 100,000 barrels a day off the Energy East pipeline if we ever got it built. Indian Oil put $1 billion into the Pacific Northwest project. I mean, there was a lot of interest in doing business with us in the energy space. Food security, Brian's talked about that, but the focus what we were taking on food security wasn't about selling it, because that's it's a commodity, and selling it, it's really about agri-tech. And I see one question is about water. If you talk about security relations between countries and water being a security issue, there would be very little role for Canada to play, but there's a huge role for Canada to play in clean technologies and building the capacity around water. And that's a really critical area, and particularly in the context of India. And technology, of course, is another area where they have a tremendous amount of interest. And then the fourth area was education. And when I started in India, we did 3,000 student permits a year. And now we're over 30,000 student permits a year. And India is our largest foreign student population in Canada now. But it's not just about attracting good, high quality students to Canada. And again, at the time that we started, it was 80% going into community colleges, 20% going into universities. The goal was to change that percentages to get to at least a 60-40. And I'm not sure if we're there yet. And Brian would have a better understanding than I do because he left there more recently. But again, it's how do you bring high quality students into Canada, but also, as Brian pointed out, with the youth population, one of the biggest security challenges that Prime Minister Modi has is around educating youth and providing them with skills and opportunity. So vocational training, which is very poor in India, is an area of huge opportunity for Canada in terms of building the relationship and providing opportunity in that particular space. So these are the 4 things that we worked on, only because I had the time to think about it at the beginning and to say, wow, how do we make ourselves relevant, quite frankly, to India? And it's really finding those areas. And again, just to build on, because I know I only have 10 minutes, but just to take a comment around some of the diaspora politics that Brian alluded to, because fundamentally, if we don't fix some of this, it's going to be very hard to move our agenda with India. Okay, we can move the agenda with the business community, but you do need the government. In many ways, there's not a lot of difference. I mean, yes, China and India are different. One's a democracy and one is not. But the role of government in India is quite important. And we have to have that type of relationship. So we do have 1.2 million Indians in Canada. Half of those, or over half of those, not much more than half, but a little bit more than half of those are originally from the Punjab. There's a very large Gujarati Indo-Canadian population, and we have Keralites and some others. But if you take a look at politically, and again, I'm not trying to be controversial here, but politically, the Punjabi Sikh population in Canada are excellent political organizers, and they do that through the Gurdwara community. The Gujaratis on the other side are, tend to be more on the financing side of things. So the Gujaratis tend to line up around conservative politics, and the Punjabi Sikh population lines up around liberal politics. That's why you have a large number of diaspora politicians, Indo-Canadian politicians in the current government. And that creates an issue for the Indian government because they see the relationships that we have at a bilateral higher level being driven by local, or not local, but Canadian diaspora politics. And that, even I think you can't argue with what the Prime Minister is saying about the Indian agricultural protests. He has every right to say something. There's actually no reason why people can't gather to protest. But what happens is it's framed in the context of, because most of the protesters that are visible and out there are coming from the Punjab, because it's right next door to Delhi, it then becomes a domestic political issue, okay, from that perspective. And that's why the Indian government gets aggravated, because they don't believe that we have dealt with the diaspora politics in a way that would make them feel comfortable that there's no support from the government for a free Khalistan, which they still believe is out there. And that's just something that we need to understand. So I think I'll leave it there because I got lots more to say, but just in case that people have questions, and Mary, I know you're going to be challenging both Brian and I on what we have to say.
Great. Thank you so much, Stuart. And you really have covered the waterfront in talking about the opportunities that there are for Canada, and then some of the issues around the diaspora, which in fact respond to some of the questions that we have, but I will still sort of put them to you so that you'll have a chance to answer them. And just on that last point about the diaspora, Ravi had asked us that Indo-Canadians have not been playing or allowed to play any influential role as a bridge other than domestic political pandering. Is this important, or how can this be enabled? And maybe Stuart, do you want to start?
Want me to start first? Well, I'd like to say that from my own experience when I was in Delhi, the Indo-Canadian population had a very important role to play in many ways, because the connectivity politically, and you have these relationships in Canada, but they have deep relationships back in India as well. And whether it's on the, again, it tends to, you need to take a look at how the politics in India are happening. And so when you have a strong Gujarati-centered prime minister in India, there is influence within the Gujarati community in the kind of political scene. It does help us in the context of what's going on in India. It tends to be more of a challenge, with the current government, because there's this perception that that it's a Punjabi Sikh-driven type of relationship, and that doesn't always play, and it makes it difficult. And you saw some of the tensions that existed around the prime minister's visit. But ultimately, and if you talk about agricultural technology, agricultural politics, and such, like, the Punjab is very important, and it does carry a lot of weight, and the influence that it has in India is quite stark. And we just did a workshop 3 weeks ago around predictive agriculture, and the role that of the Punjab in this, and the importance of it in the relative food security elements of India, it's quite critical, and we can play that role there. And just a question about kind of getting off this kind of Khalistan, what can I say? It's just it's something we have to deal with, and it's there, So,
Brian, do you want to make any comments on this?
Yeah, sure. I'm not sure that I fully agree with Ravi in terms of the question. Indo-Canadians have not been playing or allowed to play an influential role as a bridge, he says, other than domestic political pandering. My experience was that there was an awful lot of positive interaction between Indo-Canadians, certainly in the High Commission, and the business community in India. The challenge, of course, is to understand where they're coming from and what kind of background they may be bringing to an issue, as Stuart alludes. So I think there's definitely a role, but it has to be a role where if possible, it's focused on business and removing kind of some of the underlying political elements. But there's certainly a lot that can be done, and we saw that on the business side of things when Trudeau did visit India. I mean, other than the political stuff that happened, the business element of that trip, I think, went relatively well. And it was a lot of Indo-Canadians who were there for specifically business purposes. So I think there's a role that can be played and is being played. There's an awful lot of traffic between the two countries, between Indo-Canadians coming back home and developing business. But
if I can just add a little bit to strategically what we were trying to do at the High Commission. Again, the major source of Canadian immigrants from India has been from the Punjab.
Yeah.
So when we were setting up a new consulate in India, we put it in Bangalore, okay, with the specific reason of having an immigration program there to balance the immigration patterns of the two sides. So I think that's part of what we need to be able to understand, that India is a very big country, and it's not just driven by activities that happen in one state. So that was part of one of the what I would call strategic diversification within the country.
Right now, Ravi has a number of other questions, and hopefully we'll get back to some of them. But Irfan Fancy also has posed a number of questions, and I will start with the first one. We talked about the farmers' issue, and this relates to it. That he said, Mr. Trudeau has decided to annoy India by supporting the Punjabi farmers, thereby endangering future efforts for trade. Why not try to be an arbiter of the water disputes and the land disputes between Pakistan, India, and China, something you talked about, Brian? At least that would be a more worthwhile cause if we continue to annoy India.
You want me to go, Brian, or do you want to go?
Well, I'll try and give this a go, and you can add the color as you do. You know, we saw Trump try to stand up and be an arbitrator between India and Pakistan over some of the border issues. I don't know that the Indians are inclined to look to foreign countries to solve their problems. I think that they're very proud. They have an extremely excellent foreign service, in my opinion. I mean, they're exceptionally smart people there, and you have to deeply know India to be able to assist them. And we definitely have some experience with water and the International Commission between Canada and the United States on water flows, and there's lots of things that I think we could bring to the table in that regard. In fact, when I was in Bhutan, I was talking to the Bhutanese about the power issue and how they were hoping to, and I suggested that sell power to to India without getting taken advantage of in terms of prices and things like that. And I suggested that they look at Quebec and how René Lévesque cut a deal with New York State when Hydro-Quebec was coming along. But I mean, there are areas where we have the expertise of dealing with a bigger neighbor or a big neighbor and can bring some interest or some ideas to bear on that. However, you know, you can offer, but the offer has to be accepted.
Stuart, any
and
comments?
if I can add a little bit of color in, you know, a reality in the Indian public service is that people have to retire at 60, unlike what happens in Canada. So you have a lot of really smart people that are around in a number of different think tanks. Okay, there's think tanks galore and people have lots of ideas. So one of the great pleasures of being a High Commission in India is being able to host lunches with former diplomats, former national security advisors, and people like that. And we had this conversation because, you know, I was a bit naive at the beginning, and I asked this question about, is there a role for countries to play? And everyone around the table said, We don't want anybody involved. We've dealt with Pakistan for the last, at that point, 65 years. We know everything that they do, how they do it. So the last thing we want is anybody meddling in the issue. So when, as Brian says, when Trump offers his advice, Indians don't want anything to do with that. So, their perspective is we know how to do with it. But what we can do, and as Brian has said, is provide some interesting alternatives. And a lot of it's around technology, and a lot of it is, you can do this through what I would call subtle diplomacy. So when we were, for example, if they could come up with some sort of customs arrangement between Pakistan and India, it would allow for more flow of trade and goods back and forth between the two countries, which obviously reduces tensions, trade becomes more important. But more importantly, how does Afghanistan get its goods into India? These are all things so we were actually doing a program with the Indian government to help build capacity within their customs service. And they would go to the United States and they would come to Canada. And we inserted the idea of, well, what about if we include some Pakistanis and the border and customs people in this process? They were very interested. There was no resistance on the part of the Indians, so including Pakistani customs officials in the training programs in Canada, okay, to do something like this. And we never were able to get it off the ground, but that's an example of how you can kind of do that process, but you have to do it in a way that does not seem like you're a mediator, okay? You're working on something that's of mutual interest to both.
I think that's exactly what role we played with the GST, with the Indian GST. We had Indian officials from finance travel to Canada to meet with their equivalents in Canada, and so there's no question that India is open to some other ideas, and they do that. They as any country does, they sort of scour the globe when they have an issue and see if somebody else has dealt with it before. So there are ways that we do play a role, but it's not like you can go in and tell them, oh, we know how this works because we've got this international commission in Canada and this is how you deal with water and blah, 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 blah. The Indians won't accept that.
Right. Thank you. I'm going to move to a question from Paul Stinson. It's a different topic. And he asks that India sees China as a major threat, not just because of the border tensions, which flared up recently. Many Indians like Trump because he stood up to China in the last 12 months, and they fear that Biden will not be as strong against China. Any thoughts you would like to share on that topic? Don't both speak at once.
No, I'm happy to speak, but I want to let Brian go first. So.
Okay.
Sure, I'll take a shot. I mean, it's really this issue with respect to the border skirmishes is an interesting one. It's a big issue for India, but for the Chinese, it's not in the news in China. It's not an issue. It's just part of the sort of the daily routine. So the Indians do get concerned about China, but don't forget that India and China were until, and I'll come back to this, were India's major number one trading partner was China. And I'll tell my water cooler story. When I first got to India, I went out to buy a water cooler, one of the, you get fresh water from it. Indians use that for a different thing. But anyway, I went and I said to the guy that I was trying to buy this water cooler from, why do I have to spend so much money for this Tata water cooler? And he said, well, that was because it's made in China. And I said, oh, so you mean, and so I didn't know, naivety. So India has huge investments in China as well through some of their big companies. And they've always had, because of India's independence, they've always had an okay alliance. Xi Jinping has changed that, and it's not just for India. He's changed that view for the whole world. I mean, they see themselves as the center of the universe now, perhaps, and it's changing. So Trump, they like Trump, or some perhaps like Trump standing up to China, and he stood up to China with varying degrees of success. Regardless of the trade wars, I don't really think that much changed in Xi Jinping's mind in terms of where he wants to take China and where China will become the largest economy in the world, as Stuart pointed out. So China is obviously a player, and it's a big issue in that country, and the support that they offer to Pakistan bothers India to no end. But they also recognize, and they're astute enough to recognize, that China is a powerhouse that they have to deal with and have to continue to work with on a trade and investment sort of perspective. But they're also very astute in terms of how they deal with China. I showed the slide of the strings of pearl. Well, India's strategy around this is to not even acknowledge that they exist. So they know they're there, but they're not talking about it, and they're not really pushing China to get rid of those strings of pearl. They're just not saying anything about it. And so, when Biden comes in, and if relations with China warm slightly, I can't see that they're going to ever get back to pre-Xing kinds of levels. Stuart probably has way more views on this than I. But it's I think it's just something that the Indians are going to focus on in their own way again, and deal with China as they need to do to protect their land interests and their water interests and their resource interests, and also to deal with the Pakistani issue and the border and the line of control there. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't know that there's going to be a huge change.
Right.
And
Sure.
if I could just add a couple of words to that, I mean, like Pakistan, India has been dealing with China for an awful long time, thousands of years. And so these issues have been, how they've been managing the issues, again, is really on a bilateral basis. And one thing I can say, because I spent time in China, the Indian diplomats, particularly those that have the experience of China, are unbelievably good. So there's a cadre of Indian diplomats with vast China experience, including the current foreign minister. So you have this experience, and again, it's one of those things where they will not really, they'll form an alliance when it's convenient to them, but at the end of the day, they really know how to deal with China. Now, China, particularly after 1960. When the Indians got spanked by the Chinese, in the very quick war, that's had a lasting, impact on the current. And I say current, it's a relatively recent event as far as between China and India, and it does have an impact on their own, what I would call mienza, their face, right, from the Indian perspective. So a lot of the reaction that you're seeing, particularly in the most recent incident, is, they've been quite dramatic in terms of what they've done with apps and other things in terms of tariffs and coming down a lot harder on China, which I think was a bit surprising to China, because I think they didn't really realize, and it does have an economic impact on them. So, but to Brian's point, China is a big investor in India now, so it's really a question of how you balance this. And I will always be on the side of Indian diplomats. They will come up with solutions that, again, are really pragmatic, but also done in a way that understands how these type of negotiations happen between the two sides. Paul also brought up something else in the Q&A, which I think is important. If you don't mind, I'll just add a few words, because this is something that Canada has to consider. And this is the notion of Indo-Pacific and how we align ourselves on this. So free and open Indo-Pacific is something that the Japanese government has been promoting. It's been somewhat hijacked by the Trump administration to become a containment militaristic concept of the Indo-Pacific. So we've done a paper, and again, I would encourage people, if they're interested, to know where we come from on the foundation. Jeff Reeves, our VP Research, did a great paper called Diverse and Inclusive as opposed to Free and Open. So free and open, unfortunately, even though Indo-Pacific, there's no organization around it, but it's become a concept. The free and open Indo-Pacific is more of a military containment US approach. Diverse and inclusive is what you're seeing coming out of the EU, France and Germany. And so if we want to align, I think we have to be quite sensible, because, do we want to become part of the Quad? It doesn't make any sense, because we don't really have any assets to put in there. Do we want to align with the Australians and the the Japanese and the Americans on a free and open concept. I don't include India because India is part of the Quad and have bought into the free and open concept, but they've been talking about free and open Indo-Pacific from my days in India back in 2010. This is not a new concept to them, but their view of the Indo-Pacific and the Indian Ocean is much broader than how it's defined by Japan and Australia and the United States. So again, I think if you're interested in the topic, Paul, I mean, and others, read the paper because it brings a lot of different elements into it because it's a much broader you need a much broader understanding of what's involved. And we really have no skin in the Indian Ocean game right now. If we were shipping natural gas either around the Cape or through the Suez Canal, yes, we would have skin in the security dimension of the Indian Ocean, but we don't. Not right now, we don't.
We
And
do,
most of
we do, and Stuart, in the sense that we're a member of NATO and we've had resources deployed, not deployed, but resources in the UK looking at the pirate issue and all that sort of stuff. But you're right, we don't have.
But it's minimal, quite frankly.
It's very minimal. And I mean, it might increase if we ever start shipping oil or natural gas there. I just, one of the things that I neglected to say, it's really interesting to note that the United States is now India's largest trading partner. And the reason for that is the Indians, notwithstanding our great assets and capabilities in oil and gas, have increased their purchases of American oil by something like 8 billion. No, it wasn't that much, but a lot of new
and gas.
Oil and gas both are coming to India to meet their needs, and that has put the Americans over the top in terms of their largest exports to India. We could have done that, I suppose, had the Northwest gas worked out, but that didn't go anywhere, and it kind of left a bad taste in Indian Oil's mouth, I must say, Stuart. So that's a challenge for Canada, and I don't know that we're going to be seeing a lot of oil and gas going to India in the near future, anyway.
Well, unfortunately, it is something that would be an important strategic tool in our toolkit. And you know, at the recent ABAC meeting, Prime Minister Trudeau was one of the speakers, and he actually was introduced by the Petronas CEO, and he talked about Canada's role in supplying gas as a transition fuel to Asia. And, you know, one of the issues, if we could get a pipeline to the East Coast, it gives us a real important strategic tool in our toolkit. It's a carbon issue, but it's something that we can't ignore. It's something that's important for us as a country to be able to understand as a transition fuel in particular. We should be selling gas into India right now. It's shorter from the east coast of Canada. You know, we have the ability and the interest on the part of not just India. I mean, we could be selling it into Europe and other places as well, but certainly it gives us a real strategic tool in our foreign policy toolkit.
Right. Yeah. That certainly raises lots of other issues, Stuart, that we won't get to today, but I would like to get to a couple of more questions, and one again from Ravi Sithapathy. I think you probably know him. He talks as my ICCC presidency from 1998 to 2000 when Pokhran II happened. We had to pivot, and the Right Honorable David Johnson and Ravi co-chaired the S&T, I assume that Science and Technology study, which enabled the bilateral S&T agreement in 2004. So what other such initiatives can we undertake?
We'll take a go at this. One of the areas that we were promoting, it came up around the time of Trudeau's visit in 2018. We had an impromptu CEO forum between India and Canada. And the presentation that was made to the two prime ministers by the business community focused on artificial intelligence and how India and Canada could collaborate on artificial intelligence research and rolling that sort of AI into mainstream thinking and perhaps exchanging researchers and things like that. I don't know what became of that, but I do know that the continuing discussions between Canada and India around AI are now kind of rolled into that S&T dialogue. But that's another specific area that could happen. Obviously, India's got a big challenge on climate change. I don't know if they'd be open to kind of dialogue on climate change or not, but there are a number of areas, I think, Ravi, that could be enhanced through more joint initiatives.
Yeah, and if I can just build on that, it's we're actually, one of the roles that we're taking from the foundation is building that relationship between Canada and India around machine learning and artificial intelligence. And as I said, we just finished one workshop over three weeks around agriculture in particular, but we want to expand it because the importance really is coming up with a model which will allow us to exchange data. So agriculture is relatively less controversial in terms of data exchange and data governance. So the whole idea behind what we're doing with India right now is coming up with a framework which would allow us to work together in that particular space. India is a member of the Global Partnership on AI, which is based out of Montreal. The person I'm working with in India is on Prime Minister Modi's National Strategic Advisory Board. He's responsible for AI. He wrote the paper on the AI task force. He understands the role that Canada can play and the leadership role that we have. And so this is one area where I think has tremendous amount of potential because it's not just in agriculture, it's in health, it's also in clean technologies. And so it cuts across a number of different areas. And, again, this is where you build a knowledge network that exists between our two countries. Professor Kamakoti, who is out of IIT Madras, he has eight PhD students that he has of his own that are now teaching in Canada. So there's this understanding at that level between our two countries that really is quite remarkable. And it doesn't need sort of a government imprimatur to make it happen. It's nice to have a science and technology agreement, but this is the people to people relationships that we have, that we can build some really interesting things. And it's really important to India, because if we can work in the agriculture food security space with India in this collaborative way, it's going to help us sell more pulses at the end of the day. So it's really how we build that type of strategic collaboration. And he was mentioning David Johnson, who at the time I was High Commissioner, came to India as Governor General. I mean, he is revered. I mean, he's the type of person who uses knowledge diplomacy in a way that is remarkable, and it's something where we can really build on our advantages in a place like India.
I really like your suggestion of the knowledge network, Stuart. That's really resonates. But who should take the leadership role in moving those kinds of things forward? What you talked about is obviously so important and relevant.
Well, John Stackhouse has written a book on Planet Canada. And one of the things that he talks about is the importance to building networks. And he was using the C100, which I was involved with when I was in San Francisco, as an example of a group of Canadians that are outside the country that are helping Canadian startups and young Canadian technology companies. But he's basically saying that network needs to be broader. So it's not just Canadians that would be in Asia, but it's also those that have that relationship that go back and forth. So and he believes the government should be resourcing something like this and building that network and resourcing it and then using it to its advantage. So I think there is a role for government in something like this.
Well, we had a wonderful conversation with John at CIC just a couple of weeks ago too. It was fascinating, as is his book. Brian, any comments that you might have?
Well, sure. I mean, there's any number of areas that we can further enhance our relationship. I mean, the obvious one right now is health, and I mean, India is coping with the COVID crisis barely, but as we saw in the Globe and Mail this morning, it's going to be producing vaccines and all of that. But that's not really where I'm going. What I'm talking about is health training, for example. I had the misfortune to end up in the hospital in India, and while I was there, the doctors are first class. They're highly trained, whether they're trained overseas or in India. They are very excellent doctors, and we see that because there's so many of them in North America. but they need a tremendous amount of help with the support network, the nurses and all of that sort of thing. And I think that's an area of training that we could focus on. I think we could focus on, opening some kind of educational institute in India where we train nurses and clinicians and all these sorts of things. So that's one area. Just back on the AI, a number of companies in India are recognizing AI in agriculture is where I was going with this, Stuart. A number of companies in India are recognizing Canada's strength in this and are actually sending a lot of people over to see what's going on in Saskatchewan University of Saskatchewan and the University of Guelph in terms of data and smart farming, where they find technology that is geospatial and can determine what kind of soil it has in one area and whether it needs more water than another area and all these sorts of things. So Mahindra was particularly active in this space and sent a number of people to Canada, and they're building relations there. So I think you're onto something for sure, Stuart, with respect to this agriculture stuff and the technology that's enhancing the production and capabilities. And what's going to happen is India can become much more productive. We know India is, one of the things that I forgot to mention in my talk is, with all of those people involved in farming, 47% of the population generates only 15% of the GDP of India. So it's an unproductive sector, particularly in India, and that comes from the small sizes of the farms and the lack of technology that's being applied. And also it's a problem with the subsidy system in agriculture, where they're putting way too much nitrogen on the soil and not enough potash and urea. It's definitely an area that technology in Canada could focus on.
Great.
Sorry, I was just going to add just one thing on that is where we're going to be doing some work with CFAR and IDRC. Hopefully, we have a proposal in with some partners in India is around regenerative agriculture and how we can use AI in that space. And that falls into, and Brian will understand this, that the supply chain in agricultural supply chain in India is abysmal. So you have these large number of people working in farms, but a lot of their products go to waste because of the supply chain that they have. There's no cold chain to speak of, or there wasn't when I was there. Maybe it's a bit better now. But if we can work with them on using AI in the supply chain, that's going to make a big difference. And that has an impact on healthcare as well, because supply chain is an important part of the whole healthcare conversation. So anyway.
Great.
Just that point is a fun fact, Mary, if you will. In India, 80% of the food waste happens before the table. And in North America, 80% of food waste happens after the table.
Yeah, very interesting.
That is in a nutshell explains some of India's agricultural challenges.
Absolutely.
Well,
and we can help.
Before we close, I just would like to get one more question in for a quick answer, if I may, from you both. And that's again from Urban Fancy, and suggesting we'd love to see more trade between Pakistan and India. Perhaps in some nuanced way, Canada can encourage that to happen and cool the ardor of two nuclear armed nations to go to war over Kashmir or some other thing. And either or both of you give a quick response to that.
Go ahead, Stuart.
Well, I was giving the example of what we were trying to do with the customs officials, because this is I think anybody who's lived in a place like Delhi, Brian will understand this. So, you had such a large migration of people from what was the western part of India into Delhi after partition in 1947. The difference between people in Pakistan and people in India is very, in particular in that part, northern India, there's really very little difference. So it's, the Punjab is a big place, and you have people moving back and forth, and so there's a desire at the people level to do things. It's just at the government level. So if you can find ways to work at the people level, and if Canada can play a role in that I think is really important. But we can't come in from a policy perspective to, as Brian says, basically say, we know how to do this better than you, so you should, we should work with you on this. The issue is, how do we subtly work with both sides to say, where are their common interests? Agriculture is one particular space. We could actually take this, okay? If we are successful in what we're trying to do around regenerative agriculture, a logical place to take it is Pakistan. And how do you build those relationships and how do you build those networks? And that's where I think subtly we can have an impact. But we can't go in there and basically say, well, we know more than you and we're better than you. It just doesn't work in a place like India.
Brian?
The issue arose. It's out there often, this idea of increasing trade between Pakistan and India, and the area to do that would be in agriculture products, because the Punjab straddles both countries now. But politics just gets in the way. I mean, if you put the political and religious issues aside, it would happen. It would certainly happen, because as the gravity model of trade suggests, countries with GDP sort of, I mean, India is much bigger than Pakistan, but they're more inclined to trade. The thing that deteriorates that is distance. So they're close together. They should be trading partners, but
All right, great.
there's a lot of history.
We just have a couple of minutes left, and I was going to ask each of you if you'd just like to take a minute to add any comment that you think might be helpful to those joining us today.
Well, I didn't really touch on climate change, but obviously it's a huge issue for India, and they continue to be beholden to coal. It's a huge part of their electricity makeup. And while they're trying to find ways to find alternative energy, and the world is beating a door to India on that score for solar and wind, but they're constrained by land, which, I mean, how do you coexist a wind farm on a farm? They've also decided that they wanted to build all solar panels in India and not import them. But then they found that that was a big challenge, because making solar panels requires a huge amount of water, which is a scarce resource. So climate change will be a continuing challenge. I think there's an area perhaps that Canada can play a role. I don't know. But that's a bit of a worry for me, at least, anyway.
And Stuart, any final comment?
Yeah, we didn't touch on it. Brian talked a little bit about it in his presentation, but one of the concerns I've always had is, with the BJP, it's a Hindu nationalist party, and you had, India. If anybody has lived there for any significant amount of time, you just realize it's such a diverse, multicultural country in many ways, multi-religion, and it's always been secular. And one of my concerns is, where is this going to go in the future? The empowerment of the RSS in the context of the political environment. So this is always a bit of a concern. And with Prime Minister Modi coming in, he's done some very good things, I think, on the economic front. But on the social front, in my mind, the verdict is still out. And it's something that I think he has to be concerned about, quite frankly, at the end of the day. And that's where I think you'll see, if there's any real problems domestically, it's going to be around these issues of social integration. I think it is something that's going to be important to keep a watch on, and it's going to be concerning for Canada too.
Yeah, our time is basically up. So before we close, I would just like to thank you both, Brian and Stuart, for such a substantive, informative, and entertaining presentations and responses to your questions. You've really covered the waterfront, and I know you put a lot of effort into it, and it's been such an interesting day. And I want to thank all those who've tuned in, who provided questions, and of course to CIC Victoria for hosting us today. And I don't know, Chris, if you have anything you'd like to add before we leave.
Well, just very quickly to Seamus, Mary, wonderful job as always, looking after us. Brian and Stuart, thank you so much for joining us today, and our CIC members and our guests. This is a wrap for 2020. It's our last event, and now we're heading into the holiday break, and we're already looking into 2021. We're hoping to get back to our in-person events as soon as we can, but it looks like we'll stick with Zoom for the next few months at least. And we have some really exciting speakers coming up. We'll be putting the final touches on that shortly, and coming back to you with some of the most interesting folks we can possibly find, like the folks we brought to you today. So Thank you so much, and we'll see everybody in 2021. Thank you.
Happy
Great.
holidays,
Thank you, Mary.
everyone.
Thanks,
Thank
Brian.
Thank you.
Great job. Well done. Thank you.
You
Thank
too.
you, everyone.
Merry Christmas to all.
Mm.
Merry Christmas.